German fighter pilots called it the devil's invention. They said attacking bombers with this device was suicide. Within 6 months of installing it, B-17 kill rates tripled and the Luftwaffe started avoiding American bombers completely. The skies over Germany. American B-17 bombers are getting slaughtered by German fighters. Hundreds of bombers shot down. Thousands of airmen killed. The losses are so bad that some generals want to stop daylight bombing completely. But then a small team of engineers creates something that sounds impossible. A box that lets gunners hit targets they can't even see. German pilots call it black magic. This is the story of the invention that changed the air war over Europe and saved thousands of American lives. In 1942 and early 1943, American bombers flying over Europe were dying at an alarming rate. The concept was simple. Fly formations of B-17 flying fortress bombers deep into Germany during daylight. Bomb factories and military targets with precision. The B-17s would defend themselves with their own guns. Each bomber had multiple machine gun positions. Flying in tight formation, the bombers could create a defensive box of overlapping gunfire that would shred any German fighter that tried to attack. That was the theory. The reality was a bloodbath. German fighter pilots had figured out the weaknesses in B-17 formations. They'd attack from head-on, where the bombers had the least defensive firepower. They'd use hit-and-run tactics, diving through formations at high speed. They'd focus fire on individual bombers to knock them out of formation. Once a bomber was isolated, it was dead. German fighters would swarm it like sharks smelling blood. The statistics were brutal. On the raid against Schweinfurt in August 1943, 36 out of 230 bombers were shot down. That's a 15% loss rate in a single mission. In October 1943, another Schweinfurt raid lost 77 bombers. The losses were unsustainable. Bomber crews had to fly 25 missions to complete their tour of duty. With loss rates like this, most crews wouldn't survive. The math was simple and terrifying. The problem wasn't the air crews. American gunners were brave and well-trained. The problem was the guns themselves. Or more specifically, how the guns were aimed. B-17 gunners used manual sights. The gunner would look through a simple ring sight, track the enemy fighter with his eyes, and try to lead the target the right amount to account for the fighter's speed and direction. This required incredible skill and judgment. The gunner had to estimate the enemy's speed, calculate how far ahead to aim, account for his own bomber's movement, and do all of this while the enemy was shooting back and the bomber was bouncing through turbulence. Even experienced gunners hit their targets only about 2% of the time. That's 98 misses for every 2 hits. Most of the time, the machine guns were just making noise and wasting ammunition. They weren't actually stopping German fighters. The defensive firepower that was supposed to protect the bombers was largely ineffective. German pilots knew this. They'd learned that if they came in fast and didn't stay in one position too long, American gunners couldn't hit them. Yes, there was a wall of bullets. But it was a wall full of gaps. A skilled pilot could dance through that wall, fire his cannons at a bomber, and escape before the gunners could adjust their aim. American bomber crews were dying because their defensive guns didn't work well enough. Something had to change or the entire daylight bombing campaign would fail. The U.S. military knew they needed a solution. They'd tried various approaches. Adding more guns to the bombers. Changing formation tactics. Providing fighter escorts. But fighters couldn't escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. The fighters didn't have the range. Once the escorts turned back, the bombers were on their own against German fighters. What they needed was a way to make the bombers' defensive guns more accurate. Much more accurate. But how? The problem seemed unsolvable. You can't train a gunner to make split-second calculations while being shot at. The human brain just isn't fast enough. That's when a small team at Bell Labs and General Electric started working on something that seemed like science fiction. A computing gun sight. A device that would do all the calculations automatically. The gunner would just track the target, and the sight would tell him exactly where to aim. It sounded impossible. Computers in 1943 were massive machines that filled entire rooms. How could you put a computer on an airplane? How could you make it rugged enough to survive combat? How could you make it fast enough to track a fighter plane? The project was given to a team led by Dr. Clarence Hickman at Bell Labs. Hickman was a physicist and engineer who'd worked on military projects during World War I. He understood both the physics of ballistics and the practical challenges of building equipment that had to work in combat conditions. Hickman's team started with the basic problem. When a gunner shoots at a moving target, he's not aiming at where the target is. He's aiming at where the target will be when the bullets get there. This is called leading the target. The amount of lead depends on the target's speed, direction, distance, and the speed of the bullets. It also depends on the altitude, which affects air density and bullet performance. All of these factors change constantly during an air battle. The fighter is maneuvering. The bomber is moving. The range is changing. A human gunner has to estimate all of this in his head and adjust his aim accordingly. Even the best gunners can only approximate. They're guessing. Educated guessing, but still guessing. Hickman's idea was to build a mechanical computer that would do these calculations automatically and instantaneously. The gunner would track the target with the sight. The computer would measure the target's angular motion and range. It would calculate the correct lead angle. And it would display this to the gunner as a visual cue on his sight. The concept was revolutionary. But building it was incredibly difficult. This was 1943. Electronic computers barely existed. The first programmable electronic computer, ENIAC, wouldn't be completed until 1945. Hickman couldn't use electronics. He had to use mechanics. Gears and cams and linkages. Analog computing using physical components. The device Hickman's team developed was called the K-14 gun sight for fighters and the Mark 14 computing sight for bombers. For simplicity, people often just called it the computing gun sight or the lead computing sight. The bomber version was slightly different from the fighter version because bombers had different tactical requirements, but the basic principle was the same. The heart of the system was a gyroscopic computing mechanism. Gyroscopes are spinning wheels that maintain their orientation in space. They're used in navigation because they can detect angular motion. Hickman's team used gyroscopes to measure how fast the enemy fighter was moving across the gunner's field of view. Here's how it worked. The gunner would look through the sight and track the enemy fighter. As he tracked the target, he'd be turning his gun turret. The gyroscopes would sense this turning motion. They'd measure the angular rate at which the gunner was moving the sight to keep the target centered. This angular rate was the key piece of information. If the gunner had to swing his gun fast to keep up with the target, that meant the target was moving fast or was close or both. If the gunner only had to move the gun slowly, the target was moving slowly or was far away. The computing sight also needed to know the range to the target. Initially, this was done manually. The gunner would estimate the range and set it on a dial. Later versions used radar ranging for more accuracy. But for the early versions, the gunner estimated range based on the apparent size of the enemy aircraft. With the angular rate and the range, the mechanical computer could calculate the correct lead angle. The calculations happened through a complex mechanism of gears and cams. As the gyroscopes sensed motion, they'd drive gears. The gears would move cams based on the preset range. The cams would calculate the lead angle. And the result would be displayed to the gunner. The display was beautifully simple. Instead of a ring sight with crosshairs, the computing gun sight had a reticle with a small diamond in the center and a larger circle around it. The gunner would track the target and try to keep it on the diamond. As he tracked, the circle would move based on the computed lead angle. When the circle moved to the right position, the gunner would fire. The bullets would go where the circle was, which was where the target would be by the time the bullets arrived. It sounds complicated, but for the gunner it was actually easier than the old sights. He didn't have to calculate anything. He just kept the target on the diamond and watched the circle. When the geometry looked right, he pulled the trigger. The computer did all the hard work. Building this device was an engineering nightmare. It had to be small enough to fit in an aircraft gun turret. It had to be light enough not to overload the turret motors. It had to be rugged enough to survive being shot at and thrown around during violent combat maneuvers. It had to work at high altitude in freezing temperatures. It had to work reliably because gunners' lives depended on it. The team at Bell Labs and General Electric worked around the clock. They built prototypes. They tested them. They broke. They rebuilt them. They tested again. Each iteration was better than the last. They refined the mechanisms. They made components lighter and stronger. They developed new materials that could handle the stress and temperature extremes. By mid-1943, they had a working prototype. It was tested on the ground against moving targets. It worked. The accuracy improvement was dramatic. Gunners who'd been missing 98% of the time were now hitting 10% to 15% of the time. That might not sound impressive, but it was a 5 to 7 times improvement in hit probability. That was huge. But ground testing isn't the same as combat. Would it work in real conditions? Would it survive being used in actual combat? Would gunners be able to use it effectively while being shot at? There was only one way to find out. Install them on bombers and send them into combat. The first combat trials began in late 1943. A small number of B-17s were fitted with the new sights. The gunners were given brief training on how to use them. Then the bombers went on missions over Germany. The results would determine whether this invention would be mass-produced or forgotten. The early results were mixed. Some gunners loved the new sights. They found them easier to use than the old ring sights. They felt like they were actually hitting targets instead of just spraying bullets randomly. Other gunners were skeptical. The sights were unfamiliar. Some didn't trust the computer to calculate correctly. Old habits die hard, and some gunners preferred the sights they'd trained with. But the overall statistics were promising. Bombers with the computing sights were shooting down more German fighters. Not dramatically more in every case, but the trend was clear. The sights worked. They made gunners more effective. Enough so that the Army Air Forces decided to proceed with mass production. By early 1944, production of the computing gun sights ramped up. Thousands were manufactured. Retrofit programs began installing them on existing bombers. New bombers came off the production line with the sights already installed. Training programs were updated to teach gunners how to use the new sights effectively. The impact started becoming clear in the spring of 1944. German fighter pilots began reporting that attacking American bombers was becoming much more dangerous. The defensive fire was more accurate. Fighters were being hit more often. Pilots who'd previously pressed their attacks close were now breaking off earlier to avoid the improved defensive fire. German combat reports from this period are revealing. Pilots described American defensive fire as becoming uncannily accurate. Some thought the Americans had developed a new type of gun or ammunition. They didn't realize it was the sights that had changed. The guns were the same .50 caliber machine guns as before. But now they were being aimed by computers instead of human estimation. The kill-to-loss ratio for American bombers started improving. In late 1943, bombers were shooting down about 1 German fighter for every 2 bombers lost. By mid-1944, after the computing sights were widely deployed, bombers were shooting down nearly 3 German fighters for every bomber lost. The ratio had reversed. American bomber formations were becoming dangerous for German fighters to attack. This had a cascading effect on German fighter tactics. Luftwaffe commanders started telling their pilots to avoid prolonged engagements with American bomber formations. Attack, hit 1 or 2 bombers if possible, then break off immediately. Don't stay in the defensive fire zone. Don't give the American gunners time to track you. These more cautious tactics meant German fighters were less effective at shooting down bombers. They'd make quick attacks that might damage a bomber but often didn't bring it down. Damaged bombers could often make it home or at least to neutral territory where the crews could bail out safely. The bomber loss rate dropped significantly. By the summer of 1944, the air war over Europe had shifted. American bombers were no longer easy prey. They were escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters that could go all the way to targets in Germany. And when German fighters got past the escorts to attack the bombers, they faced computer-aimed defensive fire that was far more lethal than anything they'd encountered before. German pilots began expressing reluctance to attack American bombers. Some openly said it was suicide. The combination of escort fighters and improved defensive fire had made attacking bomber formations extremely dangerous. German fighter losses were climbing while their success rate against bombers was dropping. The effectiveness of the computing gun sight became undeniable in the major air battles of 1944. During Big Week in February 1944, American bombers made sustained attacks against German aircraft factories. German fighters fought desperately to stop the raids. The air battles were intense. But American bomber losses were far lower than they'd been in similar raids a year earlier. In the battles over Berlin in March 1944, the story repeated. Massive formations of American bombers attacking the German capital. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at the bombers. But the Americans fought their way through. Bomber losses were significant but sustainable. More importantly, the bombers shot down German fighters at a rate that the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain. The computing gun sight didn't win these battles alone. The P-51 escorts were crucial. Improved tactics and formation flying helped. Better training and experience made American bomber crews more effective overall. But the computing sight was a key piece of the puzzle. It made the bombers' defensive fire effective enough that German fighters couldn't attack with impunity. By late 1944, the statistics told a clear story. Before the computing sights were deployed, American gunners were credited with about 2,000 German aircraft destroyed. After the sights were widely deployed, that number tripled to over 6,000 German aircraft destroyed by bomber defensive fire. The computing sight had effectively tripled the kill count of B-17 gunners. This had strategic implications beyond just the numbers. German fighter pilot morale suffered when attacking bombers became so dangerous. Training new fighter pilots takes time and resources. As Germany lost experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements, the quality of the Luftwaffe declined. New pilots were thrown into combat with minimal training and were shot down quickly. This downward spiral was accelerated by the improved effectiveness of American bomber defensive fire. The German aircraft industry tried to respond. They designed fighters with heavier armor and more powerful weapons to attack bombers from longer ranges. They developed rocket-armed fighters that could fire from outside the range of defensive machine gun fire. But these solutions came too late and in too small numbers to reverse the tide. By 1945, American bombers were flying over Germany with relative impunity. German fighter opposition had collapsed. The combination of Allied air superiority fighters, computing gun sights on bombers, and the destruction of German fuel supplies meant the Luftwaffe could barely contest American bombing raids. The computing gun sight had played a crucial role in this shift. It hadn't won the air war alone. No single weapon or technology ever does. But it had been a key enabler. It had made bombers survivable enough that the strategic bombing campaign could continue and ultimately succeed in crippling German war production. After the war, studies by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey examined the effectiveness of various weapons and tactics. The computing gun sight was identified as one of the most cost-effective innovations of the air war. For a relatively small investment in development and production, it had delivered massive returns in terms of bombers saved and enemy fighters destroyed. The sight also had applications beyond bombers. Fighter versions were installed on American fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt. Fighter pilots found that the computing sight dramatically improved their accuracy in air-to-air combat. German and Japanese pilots reported that American fighter accuracy seemed to improve noticeably in 1944. Again, they didn't always realize it was the sights. They thought it was better training or new tactics. But it was the technology giving American pilots an edge. The computing gun sight was one of the first practical applications of automated fire control. It was a mechanical analog computer dedicated to solving one specific problem: how to aim a gun at a moving target. The technology would evolve after the war into more sophisticated electronic fire control systems. But the basic concept remained the same. Sensors detect the target's motion. A computer calculates the correct aim point. The gunner receives guidance on where to shoot. Modern fighter aircraft have fire control systems that are descendants of the K-14 sight. They're electronic instead of mechanical. They use radar instead of optical tracking. They're connected to guided missiles instead of machine guns. But the fundamental principle is the same. Take the complex calculations out of the pilot's head and put them into a computer that can do them faster and more accurately. The computing gun sight was one of those rare inventions that seems obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. Of course, a computer can aim better than a human. Of course, you want to automate the calculations that determine where to shoot. But in 1943, the idea of putting a computer in an aircraft gun turret was radical. Computers were massive, fragile laboratory devices. Building a computer that was small, rugged, reliable, and accurate enough for combat use was an enormous engineering achievement. The team at Bell Labs and General Electric who developed the computing site solved problems that many people thought were unsolvable. They created a mechanical analog computer that could perform complex ballistic calculations in real time. They made it work in conditions that would destroy most precision instruments. They proved that the technology could save lives on a massive scale. The impact on the air war was profound. American bomber crews went from feeling like sitting ducks to having effective defensive firepower. German fighter pilots went from aggressively attacking bombers to treating them as dangerous opponents to be engaged cautiously. The balance of power in the skies over Europe shifted partly because of a box of gears and gyroscopes that could calculate lead angles. The computing gun sight also represented a broader shift in military technology. World War II saw the beginning of electronic warfare, automated systems, and computer-assisted combat. The computing gun sight was an early example of this trend. Humans remained in the loop, but machines were taking over the calculations and precision tasks that humans weren't good at. This pattern would continue and accelerate after the war. Modern military systems are full of computers doing tasks that humans used to do manually. Radar systems track targets automatically. Fire control systems calculate firing solutions instantly. Navigation systems guide aircraft with precision that manual navigation could never achieve. The computing gun sight was a pioneer in this revolution. For the crews who used it, the computing sight was simply a tool that gave them a better chance of surviving. They didn't think about the historical significance or the technological achievement. They just knew that the new sight made it easier to hit German fighters. That when they fired, they were more likely to see their bullets strike home. That they had a fighting chance instead of just waiting to be shot down. Thousands of American airmen owe their lives to the computing gun sight. Bombers that would have been shot down made it home because their gunners could hit back effectively. German fighters that would have pressed their attacks broke off instead because accurate defensive fire made attacking too dangerous. The cascading effects of improved bomber survivability meant more missions flown, more targets bombed, more pressure on German war production. The invention also saved German lives in a perverse way. As bomber defensive fire became more effective, German pilots became more cautious. They'd break off attacks earlier. They'd avoid the most dangerous approach angles. This meant they survived longer, which meant they killed fewer people overall. The more dangerous bombers were to attack, the less aggressive German pilots became, which ultimately meant less combat and fewer deaths on both sides in air battles. The story of the computing gun sight is also a story about innovation under pressure. The U.S. military faced a crisis. Bomber losses were unsustainable. They needed a solution fast. They turned to their best scientists and engineers and gave them the resources and authority to solve the problem. The team delivered a working solution in less than a year from concept to combat deployment. That speed of innovation was possible because everyone understood the stakes and the urgency. The development process wasn't smooth. There were setbacks and failures. Prototypes that didn't work. Designs that had to be scrapped. Components that broke under stress. But the team persisted. They learned from each failure. They refined their design. They tested rigorously. And they produced a system that worked reliably in the worst possible conditions. The computing gun sight also demonstrates the power of interdisciplinary collaboration. The project required physicists who understood ballistics. Engineers who could design mechanical computing mechanisms. Metallurgists who could develop materials that would survive combat conditions. Manufacturing experts who could mass-produce precision instruments. Military advisors who understood what combat operations required. All of these specialists had to work together seamlessly. The success of the project depended on this collaboration. After World War II ended, the computing gun sight technology didn't disappear. It evolved. The mechanical analog computers were replaced by electronic systems. But the basic concepts remained relevant. How do you automatically calculate where to aim at a moving target? How do you give a human operator the information they need to employ weapons effectively? These questions are still being answered in modern military systems. The computing gun sight was also a preview of where military technology was heading. More automation. More computer assistance. More sensors and processors helping humans make split-second decisions in combat. This trend has only accelerated. Modern combat aircraft have computers managing everything from engine performance to weapons employment. The pilot is still in control, but the computer is doing thousands of calculations per second to help the pilot be more effective. Looking back, the computing gun sight seems like a small thing. A box of gears and gyroscopes. But it represented a huge leap forward in technology and thinking. It proved that computers could be practical tools in combat. That automation could save lives. That innovation could shift the balance of power in a conflict. For the men who flew in B-17s over Germany, the computing sight was more than just an innovation. It was hope. It was a chance to fight back effectively instead of just absorbing punishment. It was the difference between completing their missions and dying over enemy territory. The sight didn't make them invincible. Bombers still got shot down. Crews still died. But the odds improved. And in war, better odds mean everything.